Yes it is. At 1080p, the 6600 still holds strong, outperforming Intel's A750 by around 9%, and with overclocking, it even edges out the 36-12GB by a few frames, landing just behind Intel's newer Arc B570. But at 1440p, the A750 starts to pull slightly ahead, but once again, with a decent overclock, the 6600 catches up. It also holds its own against the older 1080 Ti and the 3060-12GB in several titles. And when it comes to performance per dollar, the 6600 still delivers, especially if you can snag it at a solid price, like this one at $190. That said, if you're open to buying used cards, like the 1080 Ti and also the 3060 Ti, they might offer a stronger overall experience. But for a brand new GPU that just works, this might be AMD's best value play, and overclocking only sweetens the deal. Raytracing, however, is where the cracks start to show, where at 1080p, even with an overclock, the 6600 unfortunately trails behind the A750 and the 3060-12GB, both leading by a noticeable 30 to 44%. And at 1440p, the combination of just 8GB of VRAM and modest ray tracing performance means the A750 ultimately pulls ahead by a comfortable margin. So is the 6600 a good value in ray tracing? Well, for the most part. Though with a bit of tuning, it continues to punch above its weight class. But I've got to say, overclocking is pretty straightforward on this card. Just max out the core clock, the memory, the power limit, and also the voltage, and that's pretty much it. And the result is only a 9% increase in the GPU hotspot and a 5% bump in core temperatures. It's honestly one of the most hassle-free overclocks you can do. There's no instability, no thermal issues, and there's no guesswork whatsoever. But let's talk about real-world performance, starting with Forza Horizon 5 at 1080p. And the 6600, for the most part, delivers pretty decent results. Overclocking doesn't unlock massive gains here, but it's enough to push it ahead of the newer Arc B570, the 3060, and the A750, but even at stock, it beats the 1080 Ti by a solid 44%. And at 1440p, it still holds strong, nearly matching its successor the 7600 while outperforming the 3060 and A750 by 5 and 16% respectively. And overclocking will net you about a 9% performance bump over stock performance. That said, Intel's newer Arc cards, especially the B570, tend to scale better at high resolutions, and in some titles like this one at 1440p, they pull noticeably ahead. Black Ops 6 is clearly AMD optimized, and it shows. With an overclock, the 6600 delivers impressive results across the board, outperforming the 3060-12GB by 19% and leaving the A750 in the dust by a staggering 74%. It even edges past Intel's Arc B580 by 7%, getting surprisingly close to the 4060. The 7600 is faster, by around 35% ahead of the 6600 at stock settings, but also costs roughly 44% more, which makes this value pretty debatable. At 1440p, the 3060-12GB closes the gap slightly, but overclocking the 6600 still makes it lag behind by 17%. Even then, the 7600 maintains a 27% performance lead, overclocked or not, but again, whether or not that uplift justifies the extra costs depends on your budget. For a game this well optimized for AMD hardware, especially newer GPUs, the 6600 still holds its ground as AMD's best value option in 2025. Far Cry 6 also holds up well, especially at 1080p. Even at stock settings, the 6600 comes close to the 3060-12GB, and with an overclock, it edges ahead by around 5%. It also continues to make a strong case against newer GPUs like the 7600, and comes surprisingly close to again one of Intel's newer GPUs, the B570. Against the last gen A750, even at stock, it's 19% faster and typically cheaper. At 1440p, the picture's still solid. The 3060 still does pull ahead by around 4 FPS on average, but the 6600 keeps its pace in lows. The A750 closes the gap somewhat, but its lower 1% lows, thanks to ongoing driver issues, still puts it behind even without overclocking on the 6600. Switching on ray tracing at 1080p, and the 6600 still holds its own. At stock settings, it matches the A750, and with an overclock, it reaches parity with the 7600. Interestingly though, 1% lows are less affected than most 8GB cards, putting it right behind the 3060, which still leads by around 18% on average. Last up for this game at 1440p with ray tracing, the 6600 continues to surprise. When overclocked, it even edges out the 3060 Ti in some scenarios, while the 3060 benefits from its larger VRAM, improving lows by around 37%. But none of these cards are really ideal for high resolution ray tracing, but among them, the 6600 definitely continues to punch way above its weight class. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p delivers surprisingly solid performance on the 6600. With an overclock, it actually pulls ahead of the 3060 and 1% lows while staying pretty close in average FPS. That said, Intel's A750 edges it out slightly in both metrics, but is still pretty impressive overall. Jumping up to 1440p though, and things start to fall apart. Even with overclocking, lows can dip further and the overall experience becomes less consistent. The A750 performs much better here, offering a 26% uplift, and newer cards, again like Intel's B570, provide a noticeably smoother experience overall. And that performance gap widens with ray tracing. On the medium preset at 1080p, even when overclocked, the 6600 falls behind significantly, trailing the A750, the 3060, and the B570 by 36, 47, and 74% respectively. The difference is extremely noticeable in gameplay though, and at 1440p, again with ray tracing, it's no surprise that the 6600 struggles hard, dipping to performance levels comparable to the 6GB 3050. But to be fair though, all Radeon cards tend to struggle here, and it's more of a limitation of AMD's architecture in this title rather than the 6600 specifically. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p shows strong performance from the 6600. With overclocking, it holds its own, matching the 3060 and outperforming the A750 by around 16%. But that aging 1080 Ti still puts up a fight, outperforming the 6600 even when overclocked by around 9%. And moving up to 1440p, the 6600 holds pretty steady. There is a little drop in overall performance, but 1% lows remain consistent with or without the overclock. With overclocking though, it closes the gap to both the 3060 and A750. Still though, the 1080 Ti and B570 offer noticeable uplifts with a 16 to 19% improvement in averages. However, the 6600's 1% lows stay surprisingly competitive, especially against the 1080 Ti. Ray tracing is another story though. While the 1080 Ti doesn't support it, the 6600 does. But even at 1080p, enabling ray tracing leads to a very noticeable hit. But when overclocked, it matches the A750 and even beats the 3060 in lows, though it still falls short in average FPS, especially when compared to that B570. At 1440p with ray tracing, overclocking helps only slightly. It starts to lag behind the A750 and 3060, losing by 9 and 16% respectively. That said, it's still a clear step up from entry-level options like the 3050 6GB, offering a much more stable experience overall. F124 delivers impressive performance at 1080p. When overclocked, the 6600 edges out the 3060's 12GB by 4%, the A750 by 10%, and even surpasses the newer B570 by 6%, coming surprisingly close to the ARC B580. But at 1440p, the gaps start to appear. Even with an overclock, the 6600 falls behind the A750, 3060, and B570 by 8, 17, and 19% respectively. The 1080 Ti also pulls ahead in average FPS, but in this game, the 6600's value really depends on the resolution you're targeting. Enable ray tracing at 1080 and things start to go downhill fast. The A750 offers a much smoother experience overall, outperforming the 6600 by 52% even when we're overclocked. In fact, the 6600 drops below the 3050 6GB in both averages and 1% lows. And at 1440p, performance is pretty much underwhelming, making the value proposition pretty hard to justify. For our last title today, which is Counter-Strike 2, performance at 1080p is pretty solid, especially with overclocking. With overclocking, the 6600 delivers 13% better performance than the A750 while matching the 3060 and B570. At 1440p, it becomes more of a mixed bag. The 6600 slips behind the A750 and 1% lows by about 17%, and the 3060 pulls ahead by roughly 12%. Newer cards like the B570 also deliver more consistent frame pacing and smoother overall gameplay as well. And thanks to its sub 100 watt power draw, it's one of the most efficient GPUs, rivaling even the 4060 and 4060 Ti in pure rasterization efficiency. Overclocking does bump its power usage though, but only by around 12%, which is a small trade-off for the performance gains. Ray tracing is where the efficiency takes a hit though, which isn't surprising given its weaker performance in that area. While it holds up reasonably well, newer Nvidia and Intel GPUs generally offer better ray tracing efficiency. Still, it remains more power efficient than both the 3060 and Intel's A750, making it a solid choice for low power or compact builds. performance. So where's that leave the 6600 in 2025? Well, if you're gaming at 1080p, want lower power draw, and aren't chasing ray tracing dreams, then this card still makes sense. It's simple, stable, and surprisingly capable with a little tuning. There's absolutely no driver headaches, no thermal drama, and it's a solid value where it counts. Sure, it's not flashy. It won't headlight benchmarks or win any ray tracing battles, but it really doesn't need to. It's the kind of GPU that gets the job done without breaking the bank or your power supply. In a market packed with inflated specs and prices, sometimes it's refreshing to see a card that just works. And in 2025, that might be exactly what makes it AMD's best value GPU, even still. So thanks for watching. If this video helped you out, give it a like, and if you're still rocking a 6600 yourself, let me know down in the comments below how it's holding up for you. Catch you in the next one.